Today, Poland is one of the more heterogeneous countries in Europe. Although in 2022, with the war in Ukraine, they took in around 10 million Ukrainians crossing over Poland's border, taking in more permanently around 1.5 million Ukrainians, which will no doubt have an effect on the Polish demographic. But did you know that in Poland's history, they had some other visitors from quite a few different nations around the world? And in today's video, I'd like to look at one specific group of them. And that is the immigrants from the Netherlands. So buckle up, it's Wilhelmus time in Poland. Cześć polscy ludzie, ten filmik jest dla dziadka Zuzi. Dziękuję za czekanie i mam nadzieję, że film ci się spodoba. Dziękuję bardzo. As you can see on this incredibly up-to-date map, the Netherlands and Poland do not share a border, as the state of Germany lies between. And historically, Germany was a bit fatter and Poland was a bit thinner and more to the east, and so there was more territory between the two as well. However, that doesn't mean that people didn't move between the two, as we'll see in this video, and as still continues to this day. Many Polish people come to the Netherlands looking for work, and many Dutch people go to Poland looking for their holidays. There is, however, a specific term to describe the people that I'll be talking about in this video, and that is Olęders, which comes from the Polish term Olędrzy, which just derives from people from the Netherlands or specifically from Holland. Although I should note that in standard Polish today, if you were to describe a Dutchman, you would call him Hollander. To Hollander. Now, this term itself is related to the German term Hollander, which is their term for someone from the Netherlands, or specifically, I guess, Holland, which is then related to the Dutch term Hollander, which is someone from that region. But it's quite complicated when we're talking about Olędrzy, because the ones that went to Poland, we're not always sure whether they came from the modern-day country of the Netherlands or the modern-day country of Germany, and which language they spoke or how they identified. This is because the modern state of Germany, the first incarnation of the German Empire, was founded in 1871, of course going back to the North German Confederation from the previous decade and several iterations of the Holy Roman Empire. But the German ethnicity, the idea of what exactly counted as a German, wasn't set in stone during this period and the centuries we'll be looking at today, and much the same for the Netherlands, which ultimately the Dutch Republic traces its roots back to 1579, and especially for foreigners it wasn't always easy to distinguish whether someone was speaking Dutch or whether someone was speaking German, and so frequently people would refer to them both as Deutsch or Dietsch or Dutch, or as Holländer, which we will see in this video. With that out the way, why do we get Dutch people going to Poland? Well, some of the earliest of these movements might have been happening already in the 12th century, when German-speaking political entities were moving eastwards into lands occupied by the Slavs, who at that point lived further west, all the way into northern Germany, much further west than the Slavic languages are spoken to this day. And so we already find Dutch people in the 12th century, people from the Low Countries, being moved to areas like Mecklenburg and Pommern in parts of what is today Poland. However, the big movement starts in the 16th century, at which point the Netherlands was still part of the Holy Roman Empire after having been a part of the Burgundian Netherlands for a long time. During this point, the Netherlands, especially the northern Netherlands, were strongly influenced by the Protestant Reformation, where several radical Protestant groups would establish themselves. One of these being the Mennonites, named after a Frisian Minne Simons, or Menno Simons to use his Dutch name, and many of these groups became quite unhappy in the Netherlands. Now, many of these groups were in the northern part of the Netherlands, some of them were also across the border in Germany, and so while we've thus far been speaking about Dutch people and German people, we also have a third group to contend with, which are the Frisians, who of course live across both of the borders, but have a somewhat separate ethnic identity, as well as their own language or set of languages.
Ja, wees Elsen hier in Friesland. Deze is van hem, de binnen ik Friesen in dit verhaal. We dagen er even terug voor de meisje. En ja, binnen geweldig. Laat even weten in het commentaar. Dat is de best. In het Fries vanzelfs. En dankjewel voor het meisje.
But not everyone was happy with these new Protestants.
¿Qué cojones esto? No son católicos, no me gustaría saberla. ¿Qué mierda protestante? Voy a protestarla.
The Dutch revolt and subsequent 80 Years' War was generally a bad time to live in the Low Countries, but especially so if you were one of the radical Protestant branches like the Mennonites or the Anabaptists, because as well as being Protestant, so being on the hit list of the Spaniards, they were also pacifistic. There were also plagues that spread through the land, there was a shortage of food, and there were armies, both Spanish and indeed the army of the Prince of Orange, rousing through the land and taking cattle and other food supplies. So many people, especially radical Protestants, decided it was time to leave the Low Countries for good and seek a new home. So we've talked a little bit about push factors from the Netherlands, why people might want to have left the Netherlands at this point, but why Poland? What were the pull factors that attracted them to settle in Poland? Well, we know that in 1521, a war between the state of Greater Poland and the Teutonic Order, the forerunners of the state of Prussia, was concluded. And during this time, many of the border towns on the border between them, so in western Poland, many of these towns were abandoned, and so there was land to be taken. We also know that in the first decades of the 16th century, there was quite extensive flooding in certain areas. And of course, the Dutch, if anyone, are good at dealing with flooding and with drainage. And so many Polish voivodeships, as well as city councils, invited settlers from the Netherlands and parts of northern Germany to come and settle and drain part of the marshland to build new settlements. There were already established links between the Dutch Republic and parts of what is today Poland, especially between the trading city of Danzig, as it was called then, now Gdańsk, and the Dutch Republic, as many Dutch merchants would buy grain from Silesia and other regions in the area to sell at a higher price on the stock exchange in Amsterdam, because the Netherlands needed more grain than it could actually grow there at the time. The first Dutch colonists were installed in the Zouave Gdańskie, outside of the city of Gdańsk, in a town called Zouave Wiślany. However, this didn't go too well for the Dutch, as there was subsequent enormous flooding and they asked to be moved. This they called this town Verder in their own language, but they were then moved to the town of Lędowo, and this, which they called Louden, turned out to be better, as this area had been abandoned by the Poles who were living there, but with more advanced drainage solutions, the Dutch settlers were able to make the conditions more favourable, and this became the first successful settlement of the Olędrzy in Poland, and many more would follow after they heard that these Dutchmen had succeeded. So this first successful colony was in 1547, and we know that by 1624 there had been many new settlements established, largely by immigrants coming from the Netherlands and some from Germany, and in 1624 we have our first Dutch people arriving in Warszawa, in Warsaw, so today's capital of Poland. Another 25 years later, around the middle of the 17th century, we know that they had reached Lublin, and by the end of that century we know that there were also several settlements in today's Ukraine. So they rapidly expanded out, several settlements at a time, often in lower lying, slightly worse conditions that hadn't been inhabited by the local Polish population, and when they drained it they were able to turn it into fertile farmland. So we know that most of this initial wave were largely Mennonites, and most of those from the northern Netherlands, from West-Friesland in the north of North Holland, from the province of Friesland, and from Groningen as well. Those were where the main immigrants came from. But soon after they had arrived, several others would join and mix with these original colonists to create the special sort of Olęnder mix that we would find there. Now, there were a few Poles. Obviously Poland at the time was a largely Roman Catholic country, as it still is today, but some Polish people did also convert and become Mennonites or Lutherans and join the communities. But a larger group was a second wave of immigrants coming from Germany, most of them from northern Germany, some who were already living in parts of Prussia, so in Mecklenburg and Pomerania particularly, that came, and a few other German-speaking peoples from Switzerland and from today's Austria as well, but most were northern Germans. Now, we know that there were 1,700 registered Olęder settlements throughout the territory of Poland, but we only know that around 300 of those were actually established by ethnically Dutch people. So then, the vast majority don't appear to have been established by Dutch people, so why are they called Olęder? Well, this is because the term Olęder, while being based on an ethnic label, wasn't actually used as an ethnic label. It rather denoted a particular standing in the law that the inhabitants of certain settlements had. And so Olęnder should really be seen as a legal term. And this was because the Olęnder, unlike the Polish peasantry who were serfs, so they were unfree peasants that were farming the land for a lord, the Olęnder instead came and were free peasants. They had rights to the land and had bought the land as part of their contract when they were asked to come over by the various powers in the regions that they settled. And this is an important distinction. However, before long, Polish people could also apply and become Olęnder and thus have rights to the land. The historian and ethnographer Anna Malewska-Szuegen has done some research into the types of houses that were built and has delineated three main styles. The first is the Frisian style. The Frisian style largely relies on being built upon artificial mounds called terpen. Let me quickly explain. So in Friesland, most villages closer to the coast today, the oldest villages, are also built on terpen, a kind of artificial dwelling mound. The idea behind it is that because it's so flat, the area is obviously incredibly prone to flooding. So building a house in a floodplain is not a very good idea. So what people started doing already from around 600 BC is building their own dwelling mounds upon which to build their own houses and keep their livestock in times of flooding, so that when the water rose, they would still be safe from the high tide. And this, interestingly enough, is something that we see in many of the Olęnder settlements in lower-lying areas in Poland as well, and it's clearly been brought with them by the people that were living in Friesland on both sides of the border. Another thing that's interesting is that the type of house being built by the Frisians is different in Poland as well, and that is a very long house for housing several families as well as the cattle. So the barns were built into the house at the same time, so they shared that space, and they often had a kind of L shape to separate off where the cattle were living and where the people were living, as well as an attic for the hay to keep it dry, and where indeed the family could shelter if the entire house was flooded. The second type is the German type of house. This was very similar to the Frisian type of house, apart from that it was straight. There was no L coming off. And these houses could be very long, as they housed many different families in different blocks. Up to around 40 meters are the longest. The third type is the so-called Polish type, which is that it was very similar to what Polish people in non-Olęnder villages were also doing, in that the houses were freestanding. They were not all connected together with the barns. However, what set apart the Olęnder settlements that use this style of housing is that they were far more spaced out, whereas the Polish villages were more like small clusters. These ones were far more spaced out and closer to the farmland, which was divided up into strips, and each farmer would connect their little house and barn to a main long road going through the village with their own track. Still to this day, these settlements are looking quite different from those Polish settlements around them, based on some classic finds, like of course this very Dutch looking windmill, which they partially used to pump the water out, as well as the style of building, which has clearly been influenced more by Dutch and German style houses than by Polish houses around. Although having said that, there is a lot of regional variation in Olęnder villages and architecture, and they did also take over some of the local Polish building traditions rather than just carbon copying their own homes from the Netherlands and Friesland and Germany over to these areas. Another big difference was in the way that the villages organized themselves politically. Whereas most Polish villages at the time had a headman who would be the contact point for the village with the wider authorities, these Olęnder villages were different in that they acted as congregations and didn't really nominate one person to go forward. One of the key attractions for Dutch people coming to Poland was the religious freedoms that were enshrined in the Decree of Warsaw, signed in 1573, which allowed religious freedom in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. This being one of the reasons why this was one of the major enclaves for Jewish people in the Middle Ages and afterwards, in fact for a long time being the country on earth with the most Jewish people within it because of the religious tolerance afforded them there. The Protestants coming from the Netherlands hoped that the same would be true for them, and largely it was. Although in some communities, like in that of Warsaw, the Roman Catholic population did discriminate against them. They were also banned from certain trade fairs in the city of Danzig, as well at the behest of the local merchants. But on the whole, they seem to have got along quite well with the local Roman Catholic population. However, for the first 2 centuries when they were living in Poland, they weren't allowed to build their own churches, and so their own ceremonies had to happen within the farmsteads that they built. Although this changed in the second half of the 18th century, and from the 19th century, several wooden churches were being built by the Mennonites and some by the Lutherans, and they were able to worship in these churches. Now, it's quite interesting to see some of the internal politics between this quite mixed group of Mennonite immigrants coming over. So on the one hand, you had a Frisian school of the Mennonite teaching, which was a little bit more liberal. This was in stark contrast to another large group of immigrants from Flanders, the Flemish Mennonite school, being more conservative, and so these 2 branches of the Mennonite church often clashed in the settlements in Poland. It's quite interesting to look specifically at the Flemish school, because we know that in the Flemish strain they actively kept up relations with the Dutch Republic and with Mennonites in the Netherlands, printing their own Dutch language Bibles and other religious literature, as well as inviting over speakers from the Dutch Republic to be able to keep the links with the Netherlands alive, even as Dutch culture in other areas was fading because there were no new immigrants arriving following the end of the 17th century. So this is a very interesting point about the Olęnders, is their linguistic background, because they came from very varied places in quite a wide area. They were all Germanic speaking, of course, but you had some that were Dutch speaking, you had others that were German or High German speaking with a whole range of dialects within that. You also, of course, had quite a number of Frisian speakers, given the amount of Mennonites in Friesland as well as in the German Frisian speaking areas. Many of those coming from Germany would have been Low German speakers, a particular branch being East Low German speakers from Pomerania, and of course they were surrounded largely by people that spoke Polish, and there were a few Polish people that joined the community, and so there would be a constant linguistic pressure from Polish too. What's interesting is that these languages all seem to have coalesced into a kind of common language called Plautdietsch. Now note that this isn't the same as Plattdeutsch, which is normally called Low German or Low Saxon in modern English, and rather confusingly the English term for this language is Mennonite Low German. But it is a somewhat different language that is specifically used by Mennonite communities and was developed along the Vistula or Vistula Delta in Poland during the 17th and 18th centuries as a result of this coming together of so many different language groups. A fun fact is that the father of Matt Groening, so the guy that came up with The Simpsons, was a native speaker of Plautdietsch who spoke it as a child when he grew up in Saskatchewan in Canada, although he never passed it on to his son, and so to my knowledge I don't think there is any in The Simpsons. But that was quite an interesting small connection there, and there are still around 400,000 speakers of Plautdietsch, mostly in the Americas and particularly in South America, but that's something I can make another video on if you're interested. The Dutch language did continue to be important as well, certainly throughout the 17th century when the Dutch Republic was a global power, but also throughout the 18th century. Although we think that Dutch was no longer spoken by around 1800, or certainly wasn't an important community language anymore by that point.
Dat is best wel jammer. Want stel je voor dat er nog een gemeenschap Nederlandstalige mensen was die in Polen woonden. Dat zou wel speciaal zijn. Ook een beetje raar misschien. Maar toch wel leuk. Nou, laat maar weten. Praat ik zo niet Nederlands, ik klink meer zo. Beetje een zere keel vandaag, dus daarom klinkt het een beetje gek in alle talen, maar hey ho. It's quite interesting though, because language seems to have been quite important to these people at the time, because we know that in 1762, when they introduced the first German language church service, there was something short of a riot in the church in Danzig, and they soon changed the language back to being Dutch, although obviously by the end of that century, that was done in the churches as well.
One of the interesting things about the Olęnder villages is that they had an emphasis on schooling, and so each village pretty much had their own school, although it has been pointed out that these schools were largely religious in nature rather than the kind of education that we have today. This is something similar to what I discussed in my video about the Dutch in the American Civil War. Many of those Mennonite colonies that went over to North America were also incredibly religious, and their schooling was centered around the Bible and theology and things of that ilk, and so it's something similar in these earlier Mennonite communities here in Poland. It has also been pointed out by historians that these schools were probably one of the reasons why they kept their own language, even though that language was changing. They kept their own language rather than adopting Polish for a long time. Although we know that after 1772, when the first partition of Poland happened, there would be 2 more to follow. We know that after that point, the vast majority of the Olęnder settlements came into the part of Poland that was annexed into Prussia, and at that point all education had to be in German, and so the Germanization of the remaining Olęnders began in earnest, and quite soon we know that Plautdietsch became the main spoken language, and High German, Standard German, became the main written language. Quite a few of the Dutch-speaking Mennonites don't seem to have liked this very much. Particularly the ones that remained were then subject to military service in this area that had already been going on in the later part of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, as they were frequently embroiled in wars against their neighbours. And of course the Mennonites were incredibly pacifistic. They couldn't take up arms and be soldiers, and so they didn't like the situation very much. And we know that starting in 1789 they were actually invited by Tsarina, or Katerina, the Tsarina of Russia, to come and settle newly captured areas in the Russian Empire in what is today Ukraine, in Crimea, because Crimea had just been taken from the Ottomans and they needed new settlers there, and some with engineering and water management skills. And so the Dutch Mennonites that had been living in Poland up until that point, whether we can really call them Dutch anymore is up for debate, of course, but they seemed to be a good fit, and so many of them would leave Poland and become what is now called the Russian Mennonites instead. As I said, in 1772 we have the first partition. We know that there were around 12,032 Mennonites living in the Prussian part of Poland, or what became the Prussian part of Poland, and we know that around half of those, so around 6,000 of those, left from the area. Those that remained became increasingly Germanized, of course, because they were now ruled by the Proto-German state of Prussia, and they were forced into armed service, although eventually they were allowed to join only non-combat units, so slightly in keeping with their religious teachings. Now in 1919, of course, the German Empire had lost the First World War, and most of the Mennonites that remained would be split between the territory of the Free State of Danzig and the Polish Republic. This wouldn't be easy because, of course, in 1939 the Germans would invade Poland, and so technically they would become German once again. But when the Germans lost the war 6 years later, in the last months of the war, we know there were around 1,000 Mennonites that were living in Danzig, and probably quite a few more in the countryside around it. But we know that most of those probably had already fled the Soviet advance, and those that had not were forcibly removed from their homes, never allowed to come back after the Second World War, something that awaited most of the German colonies and settlements, some of which had been around for centuries in most of Central and Eastern Europe. Here we can see a map of German speakers from 1945, and if we contrast that with a map of German speakers today, we see just how much those Central and Eastern European settlements of Germans have moved back to Germany.
Eigentlich kann ich kein Deutsch reden, aber ich kann versuchen, das zu tun mit meinen niederländischen Klängen, aber das ist wohl eigentlich niederländisch mit einem Deutsch-Akzent, aber ich muss eine andere Sprache sprechen, damit Duolingo mich bemerkt. Für ein ganz genaues Sponsoring, wie das man auf Deutsch sagt. Of course, in 1945, the Poles had suffered terribly at the hands of the Germans and their allies, and so anything that smacked of collaboration, which included simply being German or speaking German or something similar to German, meant that they were now an enemy of the state, and so they were sent packing. All of these empty villages, they had their names changed, so all of these villages would have Plautdietsch or German names, so Stalle became Stalevo, and all the other names were changed too, and new people came in. So the people that now live in these Olęnder settlements are not generally the ancestors of the Mennonite population themselves. So is there anything left apart from that of these Mennonites that lived in Poland and came from the Netherlands and northern Germany and built windmills and all of this kind of fun thing? Well, there are quite a few place names that remain. They're all Polish now, but a lot of them do refer back to this period when there were Dutch people living there. So we have, for example, Holędrzy, and others are Olędre, and many place names like this. So these are exonyms that denote places settled by Dutch people once upon a time. And in these villages, you often have many of those classic style houses. They still exist to this day. There are also 9 of the original timber Mennonite churches built in a particular style that you can still see scattered across various of these Olęnder settlements in largely northern Poland. And if you visit the city of Danzig, or as it's called today in Polish, Gdańsk, then you can still see a very important Mennonite family that was involved in the architecture there. And that is in the gate, the upper gate in Gdańsk, which was designed by a Fleming called Willem van den Blokke, who was also an ardent Anabaptist and member of the community. So his sons were all named after the patriarchs Abraham, Jacob, and Isaac. And Isaac van den Blokke was responsible for painting the ceiling of the town hall. And actually you can see very clearly that he was an Anabaptist, because he doesn't paint God as a figure. That's something that they avoid. God is simply an arm coming out of the sky, as well as giving the name of the Lord in Hebrew, which is also related to these more radical branches of Protestantism who did that at the time. So talking about the people themselves, many of the Mennonites, after they were removed from Poland following the Second World War, would go on to South America. I believe there's quite a large community today in Uruguay, as well as many others going to North America, United States, and Canada. So potentially Matt Groening's father, his ancestors may have come from Poland during that time. It's also worth noting that a lot of those Mennonites that would go on to live in Russia would also emigrate to the United States and Canada, because of course Mennonites and the new Bolshevik regime did not mix very well, and many of them were killed and terribly mishandled by those regimes. And so many of the 6,000 that left Poland would also end up in North America in Mennonite communities. So who knows, they probably had family and cousins and things, distant cousins that they were seeing. And part of their time in Poland has remained a part of Mennonite culture that can still be seen in Mennonite settlements in North America today. And one of those is a dish made with sauerkraut and a kind of pork, I believe, called bydgoszcz, which comes from Polish bigos. And there are also other kinds of dishes such as kluski, which of course sounds very Polish and is still a popular Mennonite dish, and knedel, to name just a few of them. So in a way, the Olęnder spirit lives on in the cuisine, the Mennonite cuisine, and of course in the Plautdietsch language that developed there. But there is also a personal connection. Now, my girlfriend Susanna is Polish, and you may remember her from an ill-fated trip to the district of Borgo, where I attempted to find traces of the Anglo-Saxon site. Now, I need not tell you that Susanna is a massive history buff, just can't get enough of it. If the sarcasm isn't coming true, then you should definitely watch the Borgo vlog, because it'll all be laid bare there. But interestingly enough, Susanna, on her mother's side of the family, has a Dutch surname. And I was thinking, hold on, what's going on here? This has got my Dutch senses tingling. Her family comes from the area around Gdańsk, which is exactly the area where we know that these people were settled. And so it's quite possible that back in the day, one of her ancestors was a very devout Mennonite that came from a lovely village somewhere in Friesland and decided to emigrate to Poland. It's possible, it's not necessarily certain. People move for all sorts of reasons and it could be completely unrelated, and without more research we simply don't know, but that possibility is open and there. So who knows, maybe there are still some of those old Mennonites walking around just in good Roman Catholic clothing these days. Alright everyone, if you have made it this far, then I am impressed. Let me know in the comments below, are you one of the survivors? Feel free to let me know. If you enjoyed this video as well, did you know about the Mennonites that went from the Netherlands and places in northern Germany all the way to Poland, and there made their own sites and had their own sort of ethnonym as the Olęnder? If you did, how did you find out about it? And if not, would you like me to cover any more similar topics about the Dutch that went to North America, for example, or their efforts in South America to create colonies? I was thinking perhaps to do a video about the Plattdeutsch language and maybe some videos about Plattdeutsch or Plattdeutsch and some of the Low Saxon variants or some of the Frisian languages, but do let me know if you are interested. There'll be links to several sources in the description below. And as a fun little aside, in this video I did try and design my own flag for the region. So you can see here that I've used basically the old Dutch Republic flag with a black stripe for the Germans. We have some lovely bompenblad for the Frisians in the central coat of arms, and of course with the Polish heraldic eagle. Now that was the attempt I eventually went for. I had a slightly more Frisian design as well, which we can see here, where I coloured in one of the bands red and black, so that creates the Imperial German flag in the bottom quarter, or the bottom third, and then in the top we have the red, white and blue, which creates the Dutch, and again with the Polish eagle, which I think may actually be slightly better. But let me know in the comments below. I already had one very happy customer on Twitter replying with which one he thought was the best, referring to the more Dutch flag. But let me know in the comments below if you want to make your own flag for the Mennonites, the Olęnder, then feel free to do so and send it to me on social media, because I always enjoy seeing what creations you come up with. Anyway, this has really been it. I have been Hilbert. Dziękuję bardzo I do widzenia. Dag allemaal, tegen dank en onchen. Auf Wiedersehen. Tschüss, tschüss, moin.